Okay, good morning. Welcome to our Erev Shabbat Parashat edition class. Parashat Vayakhel also happens to be Shabbat Shekalim. This is the Shabbat prior to Adar. We're in Adar Sheni actually, but we call the real Adar. We'll talk about, however, the Parashat. The question today is, what's with all the repetition? Something that actually we mentioned, I looked it up in last year's class, but we didn't address it. And it's something that is noticed by the average congregant. And it's something that is picked up upon in many different classes that you'll hear, at least alluding to this idea that our string of, let's say, 5 parashiyot, namely, Turuma Tesaveh, Kitisa, not really, but then Vayakhel, Pekudeh, it just seems to be a lot of repetition regarding the construction of the Mishkan. And to be specific, there are 5 different presentations of the Mishkan, its vessels, its walls, its covering, and all the components of the Mishkan. Number 1, the entire parasha of Terumah, where Hashem commands Moshe Rabbeinu, build the Mishkan, all the details, specificities, all the intricacies, there in that parasha, and Tesaveh, of course, the same regarding the garments, priestly garments of the Kohen Gadol and regular Kohanim. Number 2, in the beginning, and you can say a large chunk of our Parashat Vayakhel, where Moshe Rabbeinu appoints Bezalel and Aholiab to be the leading craftsmen, commands them, and they carry out all of the construction, the fashioning of all the components of the Mishkan. Number 3, in this week's parasha, when all work is completed and the builders and the craftsmen and the volunteers bring everything to Moshe Rabbeinu and they show him, we once again name all of the components. Next week's parasha, Pekudeh, when Hashem commands Moshe Rabbeinu as to how to erect the Mishkan and how to situate all the components. And finally, in next week's Parashat Pekudeh, number 5, is when Moshe Rabbeinu eventually, officially situates and positions and erects and places the Mishkan and its components in their proper position and places. 5 different mentionings. But what really should bother us more, because mentionings 3, 4, and 5 are not specific. They just mention the components. However, after all of the elaboration in Parashat Terumah as to the specific instructions of how every vessel should be built with its dimensions, with its intricacies, with the minutia of the measurements and of the material elements and ingredients of every single vessel. And then, of course, regarding the priestly garments and the threads and the materials and the fashioning and the style, etc. In this week's Parashat Vayakhel, the entire rendering of those instructions is repeated. And our Torah Kedusha has not an extra pasuk, not a superfluous word, nor an unnecessary letter. And how do you reconcile everything? Now, if you really pay attention carefully, you will see that orders change along the way. In other words, the way it was commanded to Moshe Rabbeinu and the way the craftsmen carried it out in terms of the components, what order everything was constructed, differs. Further, the way it was brought to Moshe, the way Hashem commanded Moshe to place everything, and the way he eventually placed everything are all different orders. That is a conversation in and of itself, class in and of itself, and a fascinating analysis. However, would that be the entire reconciliation, the entire difference, the answer to our problem? That would not really solve what happened in most of Parashat Vayakhel. And that is that even if order would be changed of how they actually put everything together. It would have been enough just to name everything. And they made the curtains and the aron and the shulchan, the menorah, and the mizbeach, and the beams, etc. It is not necessary to go through the details again. So that cannot reconcile our problem. And so instead, I would like to attempt to explain and solve the repetitious issue, which is really a major issue. It should be. It's not something that seems so deep, enigmatic, but it certainly is mysterious to a degree, but it demands resolution. I will attempt to resolve that with just two words. Two words in the Parashat, and those two words are Chokhmat Lev. Now, specifically, if you're following along, we're in Perek Lamed here, chapter 35. In Pasuk Kaveh 25, it speaks about the woman who volunteered their services. And there it says, B'chol isha hachmat lev, there's a patach under the head. Hachmat lev, wise of heart. B'yadeha tavu. With her hands, she spun the thread and got involved in the activity of fashioning the various necessary materials. There, the term grammatically, hachmat lev, as the Ibn Ezra points out, is a description, is an adjective of what the women were. However, 10 Pesukim later, in Pasuk Lamed He, in referring to the head craftsman, which is Bezalel, and his assistant, who is Aholiab, speaking of the talents, natural talents that they had, but then the extra boost that they received from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem filled them. Pasuk Lamed Aleph says, "Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God, b'chokhmah, b'tinah, b'dat, b'chol malachah," all types of wisdom, knowledge, skills, etc. And then it says, in a few Pesukim later, Pasuk Lamed He as follows: "Mileh otam chokhmat leb." Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, filled them. He instilled in them chokhmat leb, wisdom of heart. And it says to do the following, etc., to be able to carry out all their duties. There, Ibn Ezra points out that term is a noun. That is like saying you have knowledge, you have wisdom, you have ability to discern, the ability to measure. Here it says they have the talent, they embody the skill of Chokhmat Lev. What is that term referring to? And the truth is, and by the way, that term, although at first referring to Bezalel and Aholiab, repeats itself in describing the volunteers 3 times. On to Perek Lamed Vav, the next Pasuk Aleph, it says, "Va'asa Bezalel ve'Aholiab v'kol ish hacham lev." The 2 leaders and all of the other experts and craftsmen actually worked with the skill called hacham lev, which God instilled in them wisdom and knowledge to be able to carry out their tasks. Later, the next pasuk, that's what they embodied. Now, Vayikra Moshe Bezalel v'Aholiab v'kol ish hacham lev. Moshe Rabbeinu then summonses the 2 leaders and all of the other assistant craftsmen, helpers, and he described them as every man that embodies is a hacham lev. And then finally, later on, in Pasuk, it says it twice in that Pasuk, and then finally in Pasuk Het, when they actually began to carry out the work, it says, "Vayasu kol hacham lev b'aseh melacha et hamishkan," etc., etc. Every hacham lev who worked and constructed the Mishkan, they did and then it goes on to describe all of the details in the construction of the Mishkan. And there again, they're called Chacham Lev. So no less than 3 or 4 times with all the volunteers. And then, of course, a heading that began with Besalel and Aholiab. There are men of Chochmat Lev. They were each a Chacham Lev, respectively. What is this term? The truth is, it's somewhat of a paradoxical term. Chochmah is knowledge. We usually use the word in English for tivunah, bina, wisdom. Here, that is not included. It is included in the description of the various psukim, but in that brief, succinct 2-word term, Chacham Lev, doesn't seem to imply bina. So it seems like Chochmah would encapsulate all mental abilities, all knowledge, will, wisdom, all type of intellectual ability to calculate, to figure out, and to translate mental energy into physical craftsmanship. So what is the word lev doing here? Lev, normally in Tanakh, refers not to the heart, but to the mind. But that mental energy is already covered in the word hacham. So lev then must turn to possibly the other usage of heart, and that is emotion, inspiration. And yet, if you describe someone as a hacham lev, there's the paradox. Because if he's working b'chokhmah with his intellectual capacity and natural innate abilities, then what does the lev, the emotion, have to do with it? So let's explain. But first, I want to reflect upon some factual information. Factual information is that Eretz Yisrael, for instance, has well over, Baruch Hashem, 10,000 synagogues. Well over, that was from a few years ago, probably 11, 12,000 by now. Baruch Hashem, many Batei Knesset in Eretz Yisrael. More Baruch Hashem, 99% of them are Orthodox, because reformism and conservatism in terms of denominations are not as popular, thank God, in Eretz Yisrael as they are in the diaspora. Here is a fact. The fact is, with very rare exception, none of them can be sold. None of those buildings, those organizations, those edifices of synagogues, Batei Knesset, shuls, can be sold. And it's not because they're beautiful or they're historical, although many are. And it's not because it's aib, as we'll say, it's not nice, it's not proper. It's not because that we've given them some type of legal status at all. The reason that they can't be sold, al pi halakha, halachically, is because they've been elevated to a certain status, and that status has rendered them beyond the authority of ours to act with them, to use them for any mundane conduct. You can't sell them like you would sell a table or clothing. You just can't. And that started when? By the builders and the planners of every one of those organizations and those synagogues, when they first used their, what we'll call kavanah, it's a key Hebrew word, as defined, I'll use my own homemade definition, a well-intended mental energy for a pure objective. That's a long sentence for kavanah, but that's what they did. Here we are in Congregation Bet Torah. We're sitting on these wonderful brown chairs. We have tables and other furniture around us, right? If these wonderful brown chairs were in our living room, they would just be a wonderful brown chair, which we could dispose of if they become rickety, or give it away, or even sell it if we wanted to be someone who is efficient and profitable. But that's what they are. But because of the fact that the founders, and here the committee members and the wonderful volunteers who donate themselves and their time, when they purchased these brown chairs, they were transformed. And every part of this building, by the founders and the leaders, when they invested their intent, when they took the initiative and they invented and they invested all their efforts in the purpose, in the purchases of these items for the well-intended purpose and the pure objective of making it a house of God, a godly task was their purchase, they transformed these objects. they transformed them into something of higher status. Sefer Torah and the Aron Kodesh. There are thousands and thousands of words, and of course letters, inside in the scroll, beyond the cases. If one of those words were written without the sofer, the scribe, writing it with the intent in his mind, mental intent of L'Shem Kedushat Sefer Torah, that he has to verbalize for the sake of the sanctity of Sefer Torah before he begins writing, or every single name of God before he writes it, Yudke Vavke, L'Shem Kedushat Shem Hashem, the sanctity of God's name, if that kavanah, that mental energy, that well-intended mental energy for the pure task of writing those letters was missing even once, the Sefer Torah loses 99% of its value and is only worth the price of its parchment. And that's it. And so what we have is an amazing phenomenon. This thing called kavanah, intent, transforms the status of something physical, something tangible, is transformed because of kavanah. It's amazing. It actually is functional. It's real. That works. And so here we are back in the Mishkan, calling these craftsmen, these volunteers, these brilliant, talented hachamim, what they were, calling them hacham lev, calling them men of chokhmat lev. Basically, you want to just get that into two English words, scholarly intent, which we said is somewhat paradoxical, really simply means that all their intellect, all their knowledge, all the abilities, all their skills, all their talents would be completely insignificant if they didn't channel them into the noble cause of constructing the Mishkan for the sake of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If it wasn't focused to that godly objective, then they would just be building a very nice looking house, a booth. But now that they did, now that they had their kavanah, now that they had their well-intended mental energy for the sake of a pure objective, it's been completely transformed and taken upon itself this incredible status. And precisely for that reason, there's a wonderful sforano, by the way, that captures this terminology on Pasuk Het, Vayasu Ko Hacham Lev, Ve'oseh HaMelacha. And sforano says, this is to tell us, I've written down here, L'hodia, she'asu b'kol b'kivun la'asot rason mi shesiva. To tell us, to let us know that everything that was done was for the single sole focused purpose to fulfill the will of the commander. And that is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is what Chokhmat Lev is. And so therefore, we have a incredibly necessary repetition. It didn't just repeat in Parashat Vayakhel to summarize the actual components. Oh yes, and they made the curtains and the Aron and the Shulchan and the Menorah and the beams, the Mizbeach. No, it goes on to elaborate with all the nitpicky details, you can say, that we saw Parashat Terumah all over again, to inform you that every thread and every ounce of gold and every corner and every single moment of craftsmanship was made with Chokhmat Lev. And that's why the Mishkan is what the Mishkan is. And that's why Bet Knesset is what a Bet Knesset is. And by the way, this makes a lot of sense now of the fact that the beginning of Parashat Vayakhel, the first two Pesukim alludes to, that all of the workings, all of the activities, all of the melachot that were done to construct the Mishkan are the same melachot that one cannot do on Shabbat, the 39 Lamitet melachot, right? It's because those are what's considered to be something that's creative, something that is well-intended, something that we're doing with Chokhmat Lev. And for that reason, if you do something on Shabbat accidentally, without intent, etc., all the laws change, right? And that's why, in a more overarching way, we have this rule. It's in Shulchan Aruch. This brings it down as a dispute. Do mizvot sedichot kavana or lo? Do mizvot require intent? And the intent here means that prior to performing and engaging in a mitzvah, do I need to know? Do I need to think that this is what I'm doing, and this is why I'm doing it? This is the magnitude of what I'm about to do. And really, all opinions agree that you need to say that. And the question only is, do you not fulfill the mitzvah if you don't have kavanah? And the answer is, says Shulchan, ken halacha, you need kavanah, and you don't fulfill the mitzvah. Because to take our activities, our material involvements, of physical engagements, and to make them real, and to make them godly, we need our mental component. Every single thing that we engage in terms of mitzvot and tefillah, if they include the component of chokhmat lev, of well-intended mental energy for a godly task, they're elevated into something totally different, well beyond a physical activity, far more holy than any type of material engagement that we could ever imagine. The heavens rock when we exercise our chokhmat lev, when we perform our individual duties. And therefore, what seems to be repetitive in our parashiyot is anything but. Because when it was performed, when it was done in real time, Torah needs to tell us that it was done with an energy and a focus and an intent and a kavanah that transformed our beautiful Mishkan into what it was, the holy building that it was, and that became the paradigm for all times in all history for future Jews to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu with Chokhmat Lev. Amen. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.
So besides this